Hi, Dennis Weiss, Why Like Ike Show. We have something new today we've never talked about, new to even me. Tim Reeves, Jeff Nelson. We are going to talk about Eisenhower and monuments. Monuments. What kind of monuments, Tim?
Well, battlefield monuments.
Ah.
This is another one of those key experiences in Dwight Eisenhower's development that helped him become the Supreme Allied Commander and President of the United States. We've probably talked about his days at the Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth.
We did.
This program, and he finished first in his class, and that really brought him to the attention of important men like General John J. Pershing, who'd been the commander of U.S. troops in World War I, Blackjack, and there was a project in progress in the late 1920s, and that was to compile a guidebook, the American battlefields and cemeteries in Europe of the American troops. Eisenhower was a very good writer, which often isn't known. His place in the class of 1915 at West Point was, I think, 61st out of 164, and he was a bit of an indifferent student. However, he was in the top 10 for grades in English. And so he always had great facility with the language. Eisenhower, as we also know, had a great work ethic. And so when he went to the American Battle Monuments Commission with Pershing's invitation, he quickly assumed a leading role in the composition of this guidebook. One guidebook version was published. Pershing wasn't satisfied with it and decided to send Eisenhower to Paris for a year to visit those battlefields himself and those cemeteries and rewrite the book, which resulted in this volume here in front of me. During that time, there was a slight break before he went, and he attended the Army War College, which was another important step in his development as an officer. But Ike and Mamie and their son John were able to spend a little over a year in Paris. But the really important thing for Ike's development, he had missed service in World War I, going to France to his great disappointment. Well, with this job, he was able to tour the entire Western Front of the battlefield. And so, ironically, he became more familiar with the lay of the land and those battlefields than the men who had actually served there. And so this was, of great importance in the mental picture it gave him for when he went back into Europe in 1944.
So you just answered one of my questions, given one of the answers to, I think, my question, which is, why is this important? Monuments, battlefield monuments, why are they important? You just dug one out. And that, Jim, is he learned the battlefield structure of Europe, and we refought those areas in World War II.
Yeah, so he had that firsthand experience. And also he was able to do some traveling, which I know Jeff will talk about. And so he experienced not only France, but into Belgium and Germany and other great parts of the European continent. So again, just expanded his vision of the continent and of the battlefields.
So last time we filmed a Why Like Ike, we were talking about Ike and patriotism. Monuments are an expression of honor to the men and women who served, are they not?
Exactly.
And to the sacrifices they gave for that service. I think it's important for us to note one of the values of a museum is simply to remind people of the past.
Exactly.
Not really structure their opinion, but just remind them. Monuments do the same thing. You ask the question, who is that up there on that rock and why? Mm-hmm. All of those things contribute to the discussion of the topic, and I think all the things we see from Eisenhower said, knowing who you are, why you are, helps you live moving forward.
And so, yeah, he really did contribute to that knowledge of the American involvement in World War I with these books, and it was actually later expanded around 1939, an even bigger version of his guide. And so it did have a lasting impact, and I was talking to Jeff a few minutes ago. There was a scholar named William Lee Miller who, 5 or 6 years ago, wrote a dual biography of Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Okay. President Truman was in an artillery unit, and he was in France in World War I. But the author used Ike's guidebook to follow President Truman's unit through France, which was kind of a clever use of something by Eisenhower for President Truman. But still a very helpful book, has some great maps in it, and you can see Ike's writing style in there as well.
Okay, so before the cameras came on, Jeff, you talked about a commission. When he did this, he was serving on
Well, the American Battle Monuments Commission was created by Congress shortly after World War I. The primary reasoning behind that is that World War I was pretty much to date the largest American foray into foreign wars, which meant that a lot of our soldiers that were killed in battle ended up buried overseas. And the military and our government realized fairly quickly that we needed some sort of governmental control over these cemeteries and these monuments that are built in foreign countries. The American Battle Monuments Commission was founded in 1923. Its first chairman was General Pershing, who led the troops in World War I. He was actually chairman until his death in 1948. It still exists today. It currently oversees 26 American cemeteries and 29 memorials on foreign soil, which include over 124,000 American war dead in the cemeteries. So this commission, while it's a fairly small arm of the government, does serve a very important purpose for maintaining our cemeteries overseas. Eisenhower served on it effectively twice, pretty much right after the Commanded General Staff College graduation. He was sent to Fort Benning in Georgia for about a year, where he finally got to command troops again, and he was happy about that. But then General Pershing knew about him and personally requested that Ike be assigned to D.C. to write the first edition of the guide. Ike did that quite quickly, wrote it in about 6 months by the summer of 1927. He did have a lot of help from his brother Milton, who was in Washington, D.C. at the time working for the Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
So they got it out, finished the book. Ike then went to the Army War College, which was in D.C. at the time. When he graduated in 1928, they offered him an option of 2 postings. He could either go to the General Staff, or he could go back to the American Battle Monuments Commission. He talked to Mamie about it a little bit and chose to take the Battle Monuments Commission posting because they had moved their headquarters to Paris. And doing more work to come up with the revised edition meant that they get to live in Paris for a year.
I can see how that decision would be
his
interesting.
wife seemed happy. This is a more recent book of his desk diaries pre-World War II. And in it, it is mentioned in the editorial comments that he did admit in later life that the year in Paris was probably one of the happiest years of Ike and Mamie's marriage.
So, boy, I didn't think the show would go in this direction, but here I go. How important to us as a nation was it to have Ike and Mamie married as a couple, solid for all those years? I would answer my own question and say it is very. We've talked about Mamie's influence behind the scenes, in the scenes, but they were a power couple who operated together to get things done in life together. So the year in Paris, this is my end game. The year in Paris, that was a good decision.
Yes, you know, they had been married a little over 10 years at that point in time. After World War I, the Army was much reduced in size. Being an officer was somewhat worrisome as a career because you never knew where you were going to go. They moved around an incredible number of times in the 1920s. So Mamie kind of saw this year as a year to be actually together when Ike was not deployed or detached. And they got to take their second son, John. He was 6 years old. 2 of the artifacts we have today are the, and these are probably going to be somewhat hard to see, these are the special U.S. passports that were given to Ike and Mamie. Ike's passport has a wonderful picture of Ike. The other passport has Mamie with their 6-year-old son, John. These passports have been stamped both by France, because they were in Paris, but they also took a lot of trips right at the end of their posting in September of 1929. Ike and Mamie got together with another couple in a 1926 Buick car and took a 17-day tour of France, Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland. And in his desk diaries, he kind of proves that he's a good writer just in writing to himself as well as writing for good books. As I was researching his time there and how he enjoyed it, I came across his story of this road trip. It was basically a diary. Initially, he just kept records of how much they spent. You know, day one, we drove 120 miles and bought 30 liters of gas and spent $2. By September 5th, they had arrived in Switzerland, and they were driving to Interlaken. And so it's a 1926 Buick on 1929 Swiss roads up in the Alps, and they're trying to go over a big pass, and apparently the wives were not real thrilled with the hairpin turns and the 1,000-foot drop-offs.
Been there, done that.
They had to climb a 2,400-meter pass. He writes, "We soon learned that neither of the ladies has any decided preference for driving in the mountains. And the further we went, the more caustic became the backseat remarks about husbands with such poor taste and lack of sense as to suppose for 1 second that their wives came to Switzerland to ride through the Alps. Cannot one see mountains from the bottom as well as from the top?
Funny.
Do you not know I'll be so nervous I won't be able to eat for a week? Think of the nightmares I'll have of this experience. My gosh, go into first speed. I'm going to shut my eyes." These remarks, repeated in various keys and with many variations, were immediately succeeded by a profound silence, flavored with a distinct odor of smelling salts coming from the backseat.
Oh my, that's funny.
So their wives got so nervous one of them passed out in the backseat.
So having taken a few flatlanders through the Rocky Mountains, I can say that wasn't unique to Mr. and Mrs. Eisenhower. So, okay. Monuments. As I was thinking about how to connect that to people, one of the very famous movies of the last couple of decades, Saving Private Ryan. Mm-hmm. Opening scene and the ending scene are shot where? At
the battlefield in at the American Cemetery in Normandy.
Right, in France. That's battlefield monument itself, and
is still controlled by the American Battlefield Monuments Commission.
And people put scenes in movies to make an impact. So yes, it's a psychological impact to see it on camera, for us to talk about it today, but for Dwight David Eisenhower and evidently Blackjack Pershing, it was preserving in honor of history. Preserving the honor of those people inside history forever. That the preservation of those physical structures, those graves, those white crosses in a row, are important to all of us as citizens. I would say they're right.
Absolutely.
Okay. Where are some others that I don't know about? World War I battlefield monuments.
Flanders.
Flanders Fields.
Okay.
There are also cemeteries both in Flanders and elsewhere in France. The Commission also runs cemeteries in places you might not expect. There's an American cemetery in the Philippines.
Yes.
And there's actually quite a number of American soldiers buried in Mexico City for some reason. That the Commission runs that cemetery as well.
Blackjack Pershing would know the answer to that question.
Veracruz or somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting topic, but they all are when we sit here. Depends how you want to take it, I suppose, but it's a topic that cannot be addressed without the thought of why they're monuments, that there were battlefields, and battlefields require battles, and battles require soldiers and sacrifice. So this is a very solemn thing in its essence that we're here to talk about, that Eisenhower played a key role in. Probably very few people know anything about, Tim.
That's true, and Eisenhower spoke about how humble you have to be when your acclaim is won by the blood and sacrifice of others. That's a bit of a paraphrase, but he talked about that frequently after World War II, and also about there's a great documentary called D-Day +20, where he's interviewed by Walter Cronkite around the Normandy beaches. and talks about how his son had the chance to grow into manhood and have a full life, but how many of those young men did not. And so they're still honored in those American battlefields and monuments in Europe. So he was always very conscious of that loss.
So maybe an interpretation that will be relevant to somebody who doesn't have any exposure to what we're talking about. So everybody goes to the 4th of July parade, right?
Right.
Everybody goes to parade. You go. In my hometown of Dove Creek, Colorado, the hometown parade was always led by the Troy Young VFW Brigade. Troy Young was a soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice in World War II. And they named the little FFA brigade after him. But it always amazed me that the people who were marching flawlessly, straight as an arrow in the parade, were the same people who were stooped over at the service station changing tires because they were stooped over.
Right.
But when they put their uniform on representing all of us in the parade, straight as an arrow, 32 inches to the step, and marching on, and the honor that always passed by you. Even as a small child growing up, the honor as it passed by was transferred, the reverence of that was transferred to us, me and my brothers. So when this show's airing, we won't be too far from parade season.
It's true.
I'm urging young people to tell your young people that you bring with you the reasons why those people are in those parades and why they're doing what they're doing. And
that's how I, in one way in which I was able to contribute to that acknowledgement of that sacrifice.
So about the commission, I don't, do they manage monuments inside the United States or just across the water?
They developed 3 different monuments in Washington, D.C., which are now run by the National Park Service, including the National World War II Monument.
All right.
It's kind of an oddly small commission. It has a total of about 80 employees. 30 of them work in our capital, and the rest are all stationed overseas. It still fulfills its original purpose from 1923. A purpose which was considered obviously very important by the country and the military, not least because Black Jack Pershing was their longest serving chairman. But when he passed away in 1948, General Marshall became chairman.
Really? That's interesting.
And to the modern day, there's been about 15 chairmans, and most of the names are highly recognizable generals. They work very hard to maintain the memory of those soldiers that have fallen overseas, because after World War I, they realized that not everybody was going to be able to come home, and you weren't going to be able to memorialize them in your hometown. They wanted to make sure that those children of small-town America were remembered where they are. One of my favorite things they do is, particularly in the Belgian cemeteries, they work with local Belgians to adopt a headstone, and then the local Belgian maintains it and tries to get in touch with surviving relatives to let them know that their loved one is still cared for.
So we have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to use it up until we say goodbye, okay? Not many of us will get to make a trip to the coast of France. Not many will make a trip to Belgium. However, Kansas City has a World War I monument.
Yes, they do.
I spent some time on the East Coast. The cities there, every city has a war memorial. It's sometimes you go to the war memorial for a concert, but a war memorial. Our country is full of memorials to people who have paid the ultimate price for their patriotism in our service. I'm urging people to seek that out on your summer vacation and get yourself prepared as a parent or as a guardian or leader of young people to have this conversation. And if you need material, if you need some help, right here at the Presidential Library is a great place to come get inspired. But this message needs taken forward. Can't just stay in the old books. Can't just stay with Dwight David Eisenhower. This message of service, there are people serving us all over the world, still giving their life today. It's up to us to make sure we take care of that message the same way Dwight David Eisenhower did. Agreed, sirs?
That's
okay, we've done our little part with a TV show. Now the real work's behind the camera.
There you go.
All right. I'm Dennis Weiss. I work for Eagle Communication. Tim Reeves, he's the Associate Executive Director. What's your title?
Deputy.
Deputy. Yeah. Deputy Director here at the library. This is Jeff Nelson. He's one of the smart guys that knows everything. We had a great time today. Wishing you a great day.